So we would like to resume with our history of Zimbabwe, and we are now reaching where water cuts the legs. Pana handichazivi kuti ndiani ndilianda kandiyerero or something mwe DJ mazuva ano handichanzwi radio. Pana mwe DJ wekupower FM aiti kana akupedza like session yake. He used to say we are now reaching where the water is cutting the legs. Like I eat a loose translation of Anzi Pamvura yacheka makumbo. Because that's where we are rounding up our syllabus. That's this part of the syllabus, because we want to move on to, I think from next week, we'll be moving on to international affairs. So this is the last part of the section C of our history of Zimbabwe paper. Right. So, since I'm an unqualified teacher, Chinjado respect us syllabus. So zvandiri kufunda sinodzidzira zvekudzidzisa izvi ndinisuruziya zvinhu zvopese pandinji ndiri dovuka ndotadza chokwadi zvekudzidzisa kuna vanhu vakazviendera mumakoleji ina handinawo zviendera zvinhu ndotondinetsawo. Right, so we are going to look at the armed struggle, the second Chimurenga. So it's there is I think I need like 2 lessons, then I'll be done with armed struggle, because it has 4 lessons. So we are going to divide these 4 lessons into 2. So we are going to do 2 topics under the armed struggle, then the other 2 tomorrow, then we are done. I think we'll be left to the Lancaster House. Right. So so I think by Wednesday we'll be done. Yes. So explain the causes of the second Chimurenga, then analyze the main political and military developments in the second Chimurenga. What was the situation like? So we have to assess the impact of the second Chimurenga. And we also have to look into those people who helped in the execution of the struggle. You have to examine the role played by the spirit mediums, the peasants, the chiefs, the churches, the women, the organizations, and war collaborators. We also have the frontline states, the states which helped in executing the struggle. So first and foremost, I think I don't have to dwell much on the first lesson, which is on the cause of the second Chimurenga, because they are quite obvious. We already had a simmering situation beforehand. We already had a simmering situation beforehand. I think we know what happened after the first Chimurenga. Yes, that segregation by the whites to the blacks. What's the main cause of the Chimurenga? What was the main issue? Yes, the issue of the land. So land, the loss of land as a cause, and relocation to the infertile, dry native reserves. And they also came up with legislative acts which were tailored kuisama Africans pakona. Mitemo yese yakaiswa iyayo ine chekuita nekudzvanyirira paland. There were also causes. The Africans wanted to emancipate themselves. So there was the Land Apportionment Act and the negative effects of the Land Husbandry Act and the Maize Control Act. These were major causes of the war, and the land was the major means of production for the majority in Zimbabwe and the source of their livelihood. Like land in the. Then there is the issue of economic marginalization. I think we once explained it when we also did the federation. Like when the Africans were deprived of their land, of which this was the economic conveyor belt. Because land do by economy this. So they were deprived of their land. The Africans were forced to look for employment in mines and factories and farms where the wages and working conditions were very poor. So the compound system in towns and mines separated families, right, over long periods of time. And blacks were treated like second-class citizens in our own country by foreigners. I think we once mentioned about how there was even a color bar, like they called it apartheid in South Africa. There were schools for the blacks, schools for the whites. Stadiums for the blacks, stadiums for the white. That's why even in the town there was uptown and downtown. As a black person, you're not allowed to be found around the RBZ area, that uptown area, just after the First Street. It was white people only. The only black people who were allowed to be there are like mainly garden boys or nannies, you know, or some blacks who could do office orderlies. Like when you talk of office orderly, something like that. Then there's papa no atengesa ngoripo ndo vamwe onekwa chitoro matini varungu kuna na borodeo nekuna nani. Otherwise there was a segregation. Places for the blacks, places for the whites. So the blacks ended up being agitated and saying, no, this is our country. We must have the freedom to do whatever we like in our country. So there was also racial segregation thereof. It's an extension. Like this centered around taking the Africans as a subhuman species and included denial of access to all facilities used by whites, such as toilets, shops, churches, hotel. Like the whites created their own world. Then they also created our own world too, you know. So, and even emotional issues such as cross-cultural and cross-racial marriages or relationships, they were criminalized. So the idea of apartheid or social stratification based on race and color, right? Like you classify people in the society based on their skin color and based on their what? On their race. So there was also disenfranchisement. When we talk of franchise, we are talking about voting. My white island is voting to vote. Like as third vote citizens, Africans could not participate in politics and were disqualified from what? From voting. So many laws were passed to restrict the natives from articulating their political aspirations. And this closed the door for political dialogue and finally triggered the war. The people wanted the freedom to have one man, one vote. That's why I found out that when we got our independence in 1980, it was also gotten via a ballot. The people needed a popular vote, a majority vote. So there was a lot of like political repression and suppression, right? Like the whites had to come up with a lot of laws to suppress the blacks. Like we had the Native Affairs Law, the Law and Order Maintenance Act, the Emergency Powers Act. Emergency Powers Act yangeri kungoti kana vakanzoti pane ma blacks anetsa muno vaibva buditsanudzi ma emergency powers. Ma emergency powers ndekuti vaigona kuti right marodzi esaruvha vogona kutouya nezvimarori nemadongfeng nemangongongo vouya kubudiriro kana kuti vouya kuhighfields vovhara marodhi ese. And you know, there was also the issue of curfews. We were not allowed to move around after 6 o'clock. They were trying to limit the movement because they were now saying if these people could move, they can coordinate and fight us. So what are we going to do? Munhu wese mumba by 5-6 unofana ngomba. Ukangobatwa chete. Waibva tonziri terrorist. Yanga itori musha yegona kuraisa. Ndino wamwe anenge muningi no sekuru wangu. Anzi vanga vari mentally challenged. Yaudzwa nyaya yacho natete wangu kumusha kwedu kubocha. So amene wanokuonekwa wachifamba. Then he was gunned down. Pangofira pa angatori munhu anga aito like he was mentally, so munhu aingofamba, you know munhu kana achitenderera musoro sometimes anogona ngodi kungofamba. So he was like mentally challenged, like yes, he was having a psychiatric problem. So munhu ekuti angogona ngobuda pamba utanga ngodi kungofamba achingoita zvaarikuita achingofamba achienda. So my aunt told me that story and she said because the armed struggle was a rural based one, right? So he was shot dead, and then was shot dead vakabva body yacho iri parod. Then vazoda kuunza body kumba here. Then ansekuru vangu vakabva kuti aiwa matouraya kudhara, like it's fine, something like that, you know. So that tingangoti what I gave here is the rundown of the causes. So let us look at the like sort of the main political and military developments in the second Chimurenga, like the execution of the struggle. Kuti zvakambotangira papi zvichifamba sei ndizvo. So yatinoti prosecution of the war. So in this section an inventory of the major highlights of the armed struggle will be done. So it would not be possible to include all the events of the armed struggle because it was expansive. Yes. That's your duty as an A-level student to read on your own, but we cannot include all the... It's my duty to guide. You would read some of the things further, but I will try my best. Yes. So what we are going to do, we are going to operate with a sequential order, like we are going to... By 1963, the nationalists had secured external bases in independent African countries, such as Egypt, Tanzania, and Zambia. I was explaining this to someone when I was teaching heritage studies yesterday, that Africa is one family. Africa is one family. Is it what? Tanzania, language. Even I mean, you talk about Zambia, and I can't know the names of the name of the language. But you got to erera. Munhu weKuZambia nemushona munokwanisa kuti munonzwisana zvangofana nechamunoti chiZulu here nechindebele. Zvangosiyana mbijana. So zvinoratidza something. It shows that we are one family. And you find out that sadza rinotodyiwa even kuna Nigeria, even kuna Tanzania nekuna Zambia. We also share the same type of food. You know. So we are like one family. Even in the armed struggle, most of our soldiers were trained in what? In those states. So, like I said, we had ZANU and what? And ZAPU. These were revolutionary parties. So since they were revolutionary parties, they were dealing with an enemy with a military force. So apachashandi ma slogans ni muromo ni kutaura chete. That's why these parties, despite having formalized peaceful structures, they needed to have military structures too. So ZANU-PF, the Zimbabwe's African National Liberation Army, had the ZANLA, right? The Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, and the ZAPU had the what? The Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army. So we had the ZANLA and the ZIPRA forces, which were extension of those armies. So because they knew the revolution is so we have to fight. We have to create the military wings. So the trainings also took place outside Africa in communist states like Cuba, China, and Russia. That's why I find that up to now, China is a big ally of Zimbabwe. So let us look at the execution in detail. It's quite interesting. What was happening was quite interesting. Right? So the war started in 1966. Is it correct? Yes, it's 1966. But I got 1966. But it's 1966. The Chimurenga battle. So here the first externally trained ZANLA combatants clashed with the security forces, and all the 7 members of the groups were killed. They were outnumbered and ran out of ammunition. So the battle is believed to have effectively marked the beginning of the armed struggle, the Chimurenga battle of 1966. So when so in 1967, the following way, ZIPRA, in alliance with the South African National Congress armed wing, umkondo wesizwe, ukada kuona pa umkondo wesizwe, it simply means something like, is it? It's like it's what? Umkondo wesizwe, it's like spear of the nation or something. So they deployed 4 groups of 20 combatants each. They were coming from South Africa. So the majority of the combatants were killed around the Wangi district. Another group of 150 was deployed and met the same fate. So late 1969 and early 1970, ndaizwa momzo wangu wachinduzania. Because momzo wangu warungwa 1962 anza amani rudenga raigo nutsuka nemabullet. Painzi 6 o'clock wangu raimu murumba. Anzi taibva tatoenda pasi pembeta. Vanhu vese vaihwanda pasi pembeta. So late 1969 and early 1970, the Front of the Liberation of Mozambique, Frelimo, fighting the Portuguese in Mozambique, they formed an alliance with ZANLA. So Mozambique was Frelimo. Zandla. And with more experience, they provided training and logistical support, which proved invaluable and led to the opening of the Eastern Front. Like people could go there. Those and do our time. I think mom's one don't got second born. Panama in Sekuru is or first born. It should be 1960s or something. He loved the football so much. And Tataka Fanana like officially. Right out every time every Monday. Why we go not on Zota? Gilly not to Mozambique. Like one way Buddha. Friday one you pay that score pepe. My 4 photos got in kind. One why them 14 years. And some of them could take it as an adventure. One way go no nyenge zano tini we go class grade 5. We are 5C. Nani what end of Mozambique. Wabereka vaichie moto wana. Fanika kwedu kwa mutare it's close to Mozambique ka. Unokono why go no kwira Zupco right pinda ka mtown. Ukakwira Zupco is something like a 30-minute drive from kunana danga mvura kwataigara. Even kunana Sakuba from Sakuba unotofamba wese. Kunoti kunana mutare boys aine chichi kwa mutare mutori mboda mekuti munocrosseka kupinda Mozambique netso. You know. So vanhu vaitonokurosa nemumopinda votonoenda kuzvimakembi ende kwaitotrainwa vanhu kuchiitwa sei, you know. So in 1970 there was the formation of the Front for the Liberation of Zimbabwe, the Frolizi, by Dambaza, Chikerema, and Nathan Shamyarira, and others who had broken away from Zimbabwe, and that's what also delayed our independence. Our leaders also bickered amongst themselves, but later on they united. So they cited they need to circumvent what they perceived a tribal limitation within ZANU and ZAPU. Like ZANU was like Shona, then ZAPU was sort of Ndebele. So there were sort of some clashes in terms of leadership. Of which, like that's why we also failed on the first Chimurenga. Like the Shona and the Ndebele like fought separately. And the whites liked it. Why? Because it was a divide and rule. They could have seen good tested blacks. Regardless of coming from various tribes. So the group gradually fizzled out and leadership either joined ZANU or went to Rhodesia. So in 1972 in December, ZANU forces score military successes, yes, with the attack on Altena farm in Centenary. In the same year, the keeps or protected villages were introduced in order to deny guerrillas access to food and nothing from the rural peasants. So kwakabva kwagadzirwa anonzi makeeps akangandofana nemareserves. Makeeps angakatenderedzwa nefence, varungu vanenge akapfeka zishoti achitenderera nefuti so. Because vaida kulimita supply yemaguerrillas. The armed struggle was dominantly a rural one. Yainyanya kuitikira kumamisha. Ende magandanga ainzwa namukoma. Ndo paizoimbwa song yakuti gandanga ridyedere. Vaiti vakasvika pamba. Maiuraya huku nembudzi ne. Vainzwa namukoma. Vaimana kutoapa because ndo vaida kufaitira freedom. Ndo patiri kuzondobata last part yekuti they were also vana Mujiba, vana Chimbwido, nana mama kumushawo. Pane role yavakatoplaya in executing the struggle. Because ndo vaibikira magandanga vachitaura. Sama itoita make sure kuti nyama dziripo nechi. Ende maipinda busy futi. Because magandanga ikonosvika manheru kuma9. Papa tone spy intelligence yaitozoti vachaana 9 garai mabika sadza vouya vodya vapedza vodya mapurisa varungu vosvika kuma12 hanzi vaiti hipi lo gandanga kuti hanzi chachiriya hanzi vari kupi kwamagandanga something like that pairowa munhu, you know. So munhu wese that time aitongairwa hondo, not those people who were on the front line only. So makeeps anga akagadziriwa kuti vanhu vasape bozi maguerrillas aizongosvika kudzimba moabikira moapa chikafu moaita sei. So vanhu vakabva vabviswa mamisha bwavharira kuti pasave nethat link and communication. So in 1973 John Vorster, South Africa's Boer premier and Zambia's president Kenneth Kaunda initiated the Detente, a policy of accommodation which was to neutralize the armed struggle by promoting internal reactionary African nationalities in Zimbabwe. Muzorewa and Ngomo and Stole were flown from prison in Rhodesia to Lusaka and forced to sign the Declaration of Unity by Kaunda on the pain of losing frontline support. Like when you are kutotorwa kuti vaite sokuti sort of vauda kutotengesa the struggle. Because ivo varungu vanga vagonoti vana futi because vava ne sort of divided rule. like pekutoti pane patetu taida kubatana so vaitoona kuti alright regai tibate nhingi tikabata nhingi kanogona kuita kuti anozorikana padhiri pada kuti pane vanhu ava neana muchida kudhambisa dhiri munogona kubata one person ari wiki kutora mari ramba dhiri rino so in 1974 internal rivalry rocked both ZANU and ZAPU. In ZANU, a group calling themselves Washandi, led by Rugare Gumbo and Henry Hamadziripi, caused the major headaches of the party. Like so in 1974, in December, the Organization of African Unity, OAU, right, demanded that Zandla and Ziprat unite and fight jointly. Oh, but Murima Africans meso amuri kurwisa murungu akayakotora nyika yenyu batana itono. So this led to the formation of the Zimbabwe's People's Army called ZIPA. So Zandla and Zipra zvakabva zvabatana zvafoma inonzi ZIPA. So it had a joint command of 18. However, ZIPA did not last because of difference in leadership. Vanhu vakangoramba vachinetsana ukuru. So in 1975 there was the assassination of Herbert Chitepo on the 18th of March in a parcel bomb. Chitepo was the ZANU chairman of the Dare Chimurenga. Because ZANU PF yanga tuna inonzi Dare Chimurenga, Council of Chimurenga. Vanga vakatora maconcept because we are Africans. Vakatora maconcept na Rose, kuna na Changamire kuna na Mutapa. Ekutoti Mutapa achida kuenda kuhondo aitanga gadza Dare. So pane ndodzi Dare Chimurenga. Ritoriko ma structures acha ariko kuzanu because even up to now ariko itoriko system yacho. So it was an organization formed after the banning and jailing of nationalist leaders in 1964, and his task was to prosecute the war while the leadership was in prison because in leadership izhinji vanga vakavharirwa. So he ganga sarapanzi, and his duty was to execute the struggle. So he was also a renowned lawyer and was assassinated in Zambia. So in 1976 Ian Smith conducted separate peace negotiations with Joshua Ngomo in March. However, as a result of mounting criticism of these talks by African leaders, especially Julius Nyerere and Samora Machel, and following Smith's no majority rule in 1,000-year speech, because Smith anozendo akataura toshi. Zimbabwe haifi yakatongwa black even in 1,000 years. But at the same time, ari kutonga da kuenda kusaidira ngumu. Because akatonga futi adaku munhu yade tonga da kunzwisisa ochi, but at the same time aiti kana akutaura. Because kune inonzi diplomacy. Kana chiti diplomacy vanhu vari ma political oppositions vanofanira kunge vachigona kutaura. Because kutadza kutaura chaiye kunogona kukonzeresa hondo. Anozi kana uri president unofanira kutaura zvinhu zvatinoti zviri diplomatic. Even if you want to attack some people, haufaniri kuva blunt. Unofanira kungoneka kunga kutaura kwaunoita so it's diplomacy, you know. So Smith angari nyoka, angari tsukukuira aita akataura zvane akada kuronga dhiri rinenge rira kuti muri kunzwisana. At the same time when don't kudisai on the other end, you know. So there were leaders such as Julius Nyerere and Samora Machel, and following Smith's no majority rule in 1,000-year speech, Ngomo discontinued the talks with what? With Smith. Smith akataura rafu. Tamuitonge nyika. Ngomo akata, Ngomo chachakaoma musoro kachikati amunonyepa. Unozvinyepereyo. Anchadutaura futi. So at the same time, American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger initiated the Geneva talks. ZANU and ZAPU formed the Patriotic Front to oppose the talks. So on 26 September 1976, Smith announced his acceptance of majority rule as long as the army and the police remained under white control. Akaona kuti paakupisa pana pakanza all right, ngatitaurirane. Munogona henyu kutora nyika morana, but mapurisa nemasoja zvinenge zvichiri under inyu. It is a sort of under a government of national unity. So he also wanted to negotiate with internal black collaborators or those who had abandoned the armed struggle, like Ndabaningi Stole, Abel Mzorewa, and the Chief Jeremiah Chirau. Like Pane Vango Van Futu Haito, because Chaito Tawani leverage here. It is because I said Vanagu Unite, Vanabatana. So Ndikabatana Gina Nigim Group Rao, Togono to Fambisa, my plans and Ruguda. So in 1976, there were also bombing raids on camps in Mozambique. Rhodesians killed many refugees at Chimoyo and Nyazonya in Mozambique and Freetown camp, and Mulungushi and Chifombo in Zambia. I think you know the most common bombing in Nyazonya and Chimoyo. Kutune mass graves. Lungu mkazi asina ruko alikuwa anogara kwa Chikanga kwize uvita alikuwa kwa mtaro aiti pazakaiti kataka akatitsana kura vivid. Anoziri kune mass graves. Vanhu vakatsabvurwa nepfuti zvekuti pakazongocherwa zigomba vanhu vanguva vachigredwa like kugredwa nezigredha zviya zviya zvobva zvaiswa imomo but mukadzi paaitiudza nyaya because ndaigara kunzi maturums aiti pane period yekuti kunombomachwa kunombonhuwa ropa kunoita se because the armed struggle was also spiritual that you have to know zvaitaurwa nambuya nehanda zviya zviya kuti mapfupa edu achamuka zvazvitori spiritual kunyadzona nekuchimwoyo iko pane period yekuti kunotombodaidzwa kunodeketererwa even up to now because kunombonzi kunoitika zvinhu zviri weird nzwa vanhu vari kuimba dziyo dzehondo nekuita sei inavo vanozviona but aitiudza munhu iye so mukadzi ane one hand hanzi taitobva unogeza kurwizi nefriend yangu so pakatanga kubhururuka hanzi mahelicopter aiisa smoke so kuti vanhu vasaone zvia zvekutonga sokuti mategas or something so people began to scurry for cover in different directions in that confusion ndo pakatanga kubombwa pachiridzwa pfuti kubva mune mamwe mahelicopter mudenga so hanzi ndakatohaga shamwari yangu tichiti chifamba chinogeza chitoseka chitaura kudai then bullet rakapinda nepa she has one hand achitoti akataura nyaya dzacho idzodzo aitochema kwamunzwa achitaura nyaya idzodzo aibuda musodzi aitondoudza nyaya dzacho achitobva ikokoko kwavanzi because panenge pachizonzi hamino nedzimwe ng'anga dzinotaurwa here dzinonzi hapana maspirits enzuru dzinotoshedza ng'anga dzinotodaidzwa ng'anga idzodzo dzouya dzodeketerera dzoudzwa nevakafa vaya kuti shedzai vamwe vedu because zvinenge zvakuitika zvine zvakunyima kana peace vanhu vanenge because sort of a museum futi kaitatiwa national shrine zvakunyima peace even vanhu vanogadza pamashrines ipapapo nevamwe vari around the area kuti tikunzwa masounds nechii so vanoti mweya yaya inototaura through ng'anga nemasvikiro kuti daidzai vamwe vedu vakapona ende papakanyorwa list kare vanhu kamukadzi aitochema futi achitota one vanhu vefungo ndakafa ipapa because pamwe pakatoigwa makumbo vakadzengenyeswa nefuti pamwe vakangoigwa musoro zimbabwe yakauya neropa ichapa so like vanozonzishedzai vamwe venyu vouya vomuombera vanhu vanoita zvenyika chaicho zvanokuudza especially muafrica muno kuti kune chivanhu chiripo chinodiwa panyaya dzenyika idzi you know zviriko so in 1976 to 78 the liberation struggle intensified. In fact, by 1977 it had covered almost the whole country because hondo yakusvika una 1980 yakapisa yaimboita zvikunzi kwakati ndo kuri kupisa but period yanga yakurowa nyika yese you know so ZANU forces operated from the eastern part of the country while ZIPRA entered from the west so a number of liberated zones had been opened up where the enemy had been driven away into the urban areas and Zimbabwe's armed struggle was a rural based struggle. It was a guerrilla warfare. So mablacks akuwana training kunana Cuba kunana vanga vasimba zvisingaiti to an extent yekuti mawhites akatanga kutizira kumatowns wakatanga kutizira kumatowns. So in 1978 it saw important military victories by both the ZANU and ZAPU and the ZIPRA forces downward the Viscount plain in the Caribbean area while ZANU banned petrol tanks in Salisbury. Ndakaiudzwa nyaya yacho namudhara wangu mazuva andaigara kumashawasha duze nekufaro stadium vachindiudza dei racho razvakaitika even mudhara wepanexa pakatondiudza futi nyaya yekuti pane mafesi two ainge atori muno mubare hanzi vakatoenda netaxi if I'm not mistaken vakanobhomba papane BP share yanga iri mumaindustry pakaputika. It was meant to sabotage kuti my economic activities because the major drive of economic activities is transport. Mukatoshaya fuel munyika zvadhakwa bozi kuti mudye chaiko upfu kuti ubve kuchibataura kusvika kwatm unenge uchida kutakurwa netransport. So vanzi varungu vakadriver vakauya vakazara pakopi padhuze nepamupedzana vachiona kwaipwititika mudziso ende unoziva kuti moto wepetrol unonetsa fire brigade unonetsa kudzima. So they looked hopelessly vachiona. So they were also the acts of what? Of sabotage. Because maAfricans takatanga kupesera takutopinda takapesera matowns macho futi and acts of sabotage, you know. So in 3 March 1978 the so-called internal settlement was reached. Smith, on the other hand, and anti-war black leaders like Vanamzorewa Stolen Chirao, Vanamzorewa Nangwachin's Vatingis, was alongside Rana Smith. So, April 1979, the ANC's Bishop Mzorewa was elected Prime Minister in sham elections, leading to temporary Zimbabwe. Before Tawana majority rule 1980, Panika Zimbabwe again, Nema Gagambo, Zimbabwe Rhodesia. So this government was not recognized by any state except South Africa. South Africa engaged in push apartheid. So why it was final as you know, but it's meaning that this mood does now add so that's how the struggle was executed. So April 1979 was 1980 to Patawanachi, the independence. So that's where we are continuing from tomorrow, something like that. Yes.